The city bled gold into the evening, windows like matches flaring against the dusk. Lorenzo Castellano watched Manhattan shrink beneath him, a chessboard of light and lawlessness. The penthouse was immaculate, bereft of laughter. On the coffee table a small crocheted shoe sat like a relic. He plucked it with 2 fingers and returned it to its place as if honoring the memory of someone he was supposed to protect. 5 floors below, a different, softer light warmed a corner table in Bella Vista. Paper lanterns hummed above, a radio thread of old Italian songs stitched into the air. A girl with a ponytail moved between tables, Mia, not particularly remarkable except for the way she listened when people spoke, as if gathering stories and keeping them safe. Her hands smelled of lemon and flour. She moved with a rhythm born of long shifts and small kindnesses. Sophia sat at a corner table with her legs swinging, a folder of drawings folded in her lap like a secret map. Her little mouth was set, the way a child builds a wall when the world is too loud to trust. Her father watched her more than she knew, not because he wanted to, but because watching was how he kept order in a life where control meant survival. Lorenzo had not set foot in Bella Vista since the funeral. The restaurant existed in a different ledger, memories that were not transactions. Yet here he was, a black suit out of place amid checkered tablecloths, handguards masked as patrons. He told himself it would be quick, pasta, a ritual for his daughter, a small defiance to the months of empty rooms. Then Sophia crossed the room like a comet. She let go of his hand and followed a laugh, not bravado but pure gravity. She reached the waitress and, with no precaution learned from a dangerous childhood, wrapped both small arms around the woman's knees. "Be my mommy," she said, not as request, but as declaration. The restaurant inhaled. The moment should have been simple. Instead it landed like a small bomb in Lorenzo's chest. The world suddenly arranged itself around the single, incandescent small face that smiled without reserve. The waitress crouched, meeting the child with an honesty Lorenzo had not seen in years. Mia spoke in soft syllables, slipping into the Italian phrases Sophia clung to like lanterns in fog. Laughter, fragile and surprised, bubbled from the girl. Lorenzo's instinct was always to shield. His fingers found the seam of his jacket, as if to reassure himself that violence would answer if needed. But the urge passed, replaced by something less definable, something older than the ledger, older than fear. His daughter's eyes met his, not pleading, only bright, and for a moment the architecture of his life tilted. He had, for years, kept grief behind steel and ledger lines. Now laughter tugged at that seam. Mia rose to take a plate, and the restaurant resumed its rhythm. But something in Lorenzo had shifted like a tide. A small crack had opened, not from the violence he knew how to wield, but from the simple miracle of another human being willing to kneel and see his child. That night, over undercooked spaghetti and a scoop of gelato, a silent truce was signed between loss and possibility. No laws were rewritten. No threats were issued. Only a child's hand, sticky with sugar, reached for something that had been missing in their life, and for the first time in years, Lorenzo chose to follow. Mornings at the mansion were measured in routines Lorenzo had engineered to blunt unpredictability. Coffee, a scan of the feeds, a ledger of shipments, rituals that kept rage at bay. But the ledger had begun to include a new item: visits. Twice a week, a young woman with a laugh like wind chimes arrived with drawing pads, stray biscotti, and patience. Mia's life, in private, was not a storybook. She juggled classes and late shifts, paid rent to the ghost of a grandmother who'd taught her lullabies, and held an inner knapsack of small griefs. She had learned to keep things light because heaviness could crush you if you carried it too long. Yet Sophia dismantled her caution the way sunlight melts frost. The child's trust was an invitation she couldn't refuse. At first the interactions were small things: a new pencil, a practiced Italian word, an extra scoop of gelato slid under the table. Sophia's voice, brittle and sparse back then, grew limbs. She told Mia about music boxes and a garden that smelled like basil. She described a mother who sang lullabies in the dark, who smelled of rosewater and held her hand like an anchor. Mia listened, really listened, and in the listening, magic happened. The girl's laughter returned not as mimicry, but as reclamation. Lorenzo observed all this with the clinical eye of a man who catalogued threats and opportunities. He attempted to analyze his feelings: a weakness? A liability? A risk? He was careful always to keep distance. But evenings found him lingering by doorways, watching Mia kneel on the floor to decipher a child's crooked butterfly. He noticed the small acts that revealed a person's measure, the way she cradled Sophia's failed drawing and praised its bravery, the way she corrected grammar with a smile, the way she hummed lullabies in the language of his wife. Mia's presence mattered to Sophia, but it was not an unexamined miracle. The young woman had questions of her own. One night, while rinsing plates in the back, she spoke of the grandmother who had raised her, a seamstress who stitched not only clothes but courage into a girl's nights. Mia said she studied childhood education because she wanted children to have fewer empty pockets and more accessible worlds. "We carry the small things forward," she told Lorenzo once, voice soft as a hem. "We give them light." Even the simplest actions were heavy with meaning for Lorenzo. When Mia fussed over Sophia's cold or scolded her gently for skipping homework, he felt something unspool, a fear so raw he tasted iron. He had built his life on the premise that control equals survival. Yet here was evidence to the contrary: love could be a safer weapon than fear if wielded with care. Outside, rival crews scrawled threats on docks and made greedy offers. Inside, Mia taped a paper crown on Sophia's head and declared her princess. The contrast tightened the narrative of Lorenzo's world, the public man of violence and the private man learning small tenderness. He ordered background checks with his usual thoroughness, partly from habit, partly from terror. Mia's record came back clean: only bills and textbooks, no alliances, no enemies. She belonged to simple poverty and stubborn kindness. Each visit deepened the gravity between them. Mia did not romanticize Lorenzo. She accepted him as a man with a protective edge and a broken center. That acceptance mattered. It rendered him less monstrous in his own eyes and more human. Sophia's trust became a mirror. In the child's unabashed devotion, he glimpsed a future he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. He could keep the world safe with muscle and money, or he could let someone in and risk losing all. The ledger remained open. The world outside the mansion kept fracturing the way seasons did, inevitable, indifferent. A rival family's interest in Lorenzo's docks had been escalating, deals and threats folded into envelopes and handshake betrayals. He read those moves like weather patterns, prepared with contingency, muscle, replies in code. Yet none of that cold calculus had prepared him for the scream he couldn't erase. It was Mia's apartment that had been compromised, a place he had checked and deemed harmless. He had dismissed the possibility of danger the way people dismiss small tremors before an earthquake, with rationality. Then an early morning call cracked everything. Marco's voice was flat, stripped of its usual bravado. "They grabbed her," he said. No bravado left. Not even a tremor. Time became an animal with one limb, forward. Lorenzo's drive through sleeping streets felt like moving inside a speeding cage, every red light an insult. He wasn't thinking of the docks, of shipments, of territory. He was thinking of a pair of green eyes and the softness of a hum in his daughter's room. Mia had been a quiet variable in his life, a weight that tilted a scale he had kept anchored for years, and now she was in someone else's fist. The warehouse smelled of rust and old deals. Mia sat bound in a chair like a ragged puppet. She had been forced into a silence that flickered in her terrified eyes. Lorenzo's first instinct was to calibrate: numbers, positions, exits. His second was the one that surprised him: clean, cold fury, moving through him like wildfire. He sat down opposite Vincent Rossi, the man who'd made a career of measuring other men's fear. Vincent's casual cigarette smoke mocked the tension. "Make the docs ours. You sign, she leaves," Vincent said, as if offering wine. The offer was designed to scald. The negotiation was one only men who'd traded in blood would understand. But the thing Vincent wanted to exploit, Lorenzo's newfound soft center, was not just a strategic lever. It was a moral break. "Mess with my family, and you sign a different kind of contract." Lorenzo rose slowly, and the warehouse blurred. The next minutes were pure muscle and intent, a raid choreographed in a lifetime of cruel practice, but executed now with a different engine. This time he moved not for territory, but for rescue. Men fell where they had once stood, breathing curses and surprise. Vincent's grin cracked into a grimace as his world disintegrated into the thudding arrival of Lorenzo's men. The aftermath smelled like iron and rain. Mia was unhurt, but shaken. She trusted him as though the choice had been made without her consent and seen through anyway. In her eyes after the duct tape came away, there was something complex, gratitude braided with an anger that had nothing to do with Lorenzo's men. "You shouldn't have sent them into that," she said once they were in the car and the city moved past them like a gaslit stream. "You shouldn't have put me in the crossfire." He listened. The admission sat heavy. Lorenzo had always believed protection was control. Mia's words opened another wound. Saving someone by letting them be endangered first was not heroism, it was arrogance. Her criticism, gentle and honest, became a hinge. It shifted the dynamic from protector-protected to partners in decision. In the quiet after the adrenaline, Lorenzo understood the truth that had been lurking under their soft moments. Love in his life would require choices beyond muscle. It would require trust and restraint, things violence had never taught him. He had saved Mia's body, now he needed to prove he could protect her agency too. That became the new danger and the new promise, more treacherous than any rival family because it demanded that he change at his center. They rebuilt the perimeter around their small world. Security was bolstered, schedules reworked, routes changed like pieces on a board. Lorenzo's men read maps and rehearsed contingencies. He drafted lists of names and contacts and then, awkwardly, lists of ways to soften the household that had been a fortress for 3 years. He wanted a home, not a high-walled prison. Mia refused to be a ward. After the warehouse, she joined Sophia's evenings with an agenda that read like a lesson plan, recipes, songs, and small projects to teach the child that the world had more languages than loss. She continued her classes, kept her job at Bella Vista, and insisted on paying her share of movie tickets and flurries. That insistence mattered. It threaded dignity back into the fragile fabric. Lorenzo found himself navigating between two contradictory instincts, to control and to surrender. He wanted to strip the world clean of threats, but he had to learn that some risks were moral and some necessary. He met Mia in the kitchen one night while she organized spice jars by label. "You can't order everyone away," she said, handing him a jar. "People aren't objects." There was a vulnerability that frightened him most, the thought of being a father who lived through fear rather than love. He'd built his life on the idea that pain could be prevented through precaution. But what of joy? What of letting a child run to someone because she chooses them? He watched Sophia run to Mia during a community fair, gather her into a whirl of balloons and ice cream. The scene made the ledger irrelevant. He couldn't log the feeling into a spreadsheet. Outside, the Rossi family's pressure intensified into less subtle things, a burnt shipment, a coded message left on Lorenzo's car. The city's edges frayed. Marco advised restraint and a measured counteroffer. In private, Lorenzo argued that concessions might buy peace. In the quiet that followed, he realized peace might require a different currency, confession. If he stayed inside the old cycle, Mia and Sophia would be shadowed by his enemies forever. If he stepped away, he risked losing the only domain he'd ever truly ruled. The proposition was not simply transactional, it was existential. He had to decide what he would trade for the family he was building. Was it Doc's influence, safety? Or would he break a system and choose a new life because it was morally right? Mia and Sophia deserved a man who could choose sacrifice for love freely, not because he was forced. Lorenzo tried to imagine going to the docks and signing away territory, like ceremonial surrender. It frightened him, but the imagination also brought a strange relief. The thought of bargaining for normalcy rather than power felt like a reclaiming of life he'd let be stolen by anger. He arranged a meeting on neutral ground, paperwork and lawyers, not bullets, to start negotiations. The Rossis agreed to a preliminary parley that would either de-escalate or burn the city further. On the morning of the meeting, Mia handed him Sophia's drawing of an angel. "For when you need courage," she said. It was a tiny, absurd talisman, but he kept it in his pocket like a crucible. The day dissolved into diplomacy and the careful orchestration of men with reputations. Lorenzo sat across from opponents, watching faces that had once been easy to read. He offered concessions that stung, shipping lanes, a few warehouses. He watched his men bristle. But bargaining with paper instead of blood felt like wearing new skin. It was both humiliation and deliverance. He returned home that night tired, a little raw, and smiled for no reason other than Sophia racing across the living room to throw arms around him and Mia's voice calling them for dinner. The truce bought them a fragile breathing room. But it also opened a new front, whispers of weakness among allies and enemies alike. Trust, Lorenzo now knew, came at the steep cost of vulnerability. That vulnerability could be exploited, or it could birth a family. Which path destiny would choose remained to be seen. The truce held thinly, like gauze over a wound. It lasted long enough for the family to stitch a few nights of normal into their lives. Mia taught Sophia the pizzica dance in the kitchen. Sophia taught Mia a new way to stack blocks. Lorenzo attempted to read a picture book out loud, his voice rough but steady. They were ordinary moments made extraordinary by their rarity. Then, the night the city remembered who Lorenzo was, everything changed. A false alarm at the docks spiraled into a designed provocation. Men with no allegiance to reason set fire to a warehouse that had only been promised away, forcing hands. Men in Lorenzo's orbit panicked, old loyalties frayed. Word arrived that Rossi loyalists had moved on a front Lorenzo had not expected. The message, blood talks louder than contracts. Lorenzo's men, primed from years of reflex, moved like a storm. But this time he maintained a steady center, orchestrating evacuations and negotiating channels that would spare civilian life. He thought he had counted every variable. He had not counted one, an explosive left inside an old shipment, timed for a night when the mansion's staff was reduced. The blast rocked the estate in a way windows could not explain. Glass fell like rain. The world inside his home crumpled into shouted names and the metallic smell of fear. Mia had been visiting that night, tucked in the guest room, the two of them finally unafraid to fall asleep close. The blast woke everyone. Lorenzo ran through the foyer, doors thrown open to a clash of smoke and alarm. His mind split. Protect the child, protect Mia, keep his people from the ripple of violence. He found Mia's silhouette in the chaos, her hand outstretched, her face slate. Without calculating cost, he dragged her through the smoke towards safety. Outside, the enemy framed the explosion as an accident, but Lorenzo recognized the pattern. It was a message carved in ash. He pushed past rage and felt only a brittle, cold determination. If the world wanted to test his ability to choose, then he would answer. He refused to grant them the script where fear ruled their nights. He called Marco and the men, then stepped into public theater, a scene to force clarity. On live news feeds and with lawyers present, he presented evidence of tampering and a list of concessions he would make publicly if they agreed to end assaults. It was a gamble that required him to expose the ledger of his empire, to trade secrecy for the safety of a home. The city watched as the feared man who had once been a shadow offered up pieces of himself. There was a final confrontation in the court of the docks, not a warehouse brawl but a human reckoning. Vincent Rossi and his lieutenants, cornered by evidence and public scrutiny, found their options narrowing. Lorenzo did not raise a hand. He signed documents in front of cameras, his signature a kind of penance and a covenant both. He watched the documents change his dominion into something easier to lose, but harder to hate. When the last pen stroke dried, a silence fell that was almost sacred. He'd given up parts of his world, docks, influence, but he had kept what he valued most, the laughter that echoed in his living room, the small fingers that linked around his wrist at bedtime, the woman who had not flinched at the cost. In asking for less, he had claimed more, a family that belonged to him for reasons other than ownership. On the drive home, Mia's hand found his. It was small and warm. Sophia slept between them, a peaceful island. Lorenzo felt the shape of his future form under his ribs, fragile, luminous. He had chosen not simply survival but belonging. The city continued to churn outside, but inside the car he allowed himself a quiet surrender, hope. The wedding was small, a private sunlit morning in the garden that Isabella had once loved, a circle not of power but of people who had chosen tenderness over transactions. A handful of family friends, Maria who had cared for Sophia in the dark months, Marco standing a little straighter than usual, and a priest who had seen many kinds of confession. The roses smelled like memory. Sophia ran down the path with a crown of baby's breath, a paper butterfly pinned to her dress, a quiet echo of the drawings she had once folded in a lap. Mia moved like a tide, this time not as someone giving comfort, but as someone accepted and chosen. Lorenzo watched her approach, each step a rebellion against the fortress he'd been taught to build. He felt the eyes of older men on him, some incredulous, some relieved. But the loudest sound was the small, steady heartbeat at his side, the daughter who had rewired his world. He did not make a speech that night. Words had once been dangerous when they were promises without proof. Instead, he looped a simple band over Mia's finger, a ring that carried no ledger except the promise he had come to mean, to prioritize, to risk, to choose. Mia's eyes were wet with a joy that had been fought for rather than gifted. Life did not dissolve into a montage of effortless bliss. It became work and laughter and negotiations both legal and tender. Lorenzo spent mornings at the docks not as a lord of smuggling, but as a board member, learning to temper old instincts with new responsibilities. He signed off on shipments and philanthropy in equal measure, learning the art of civilian power, committees, votes, modest charity that made real difference in neighborhoods he hadn't considered before. Mia enrolled in a teacher training program and later ran an after-school program where children colored murals of imagined streets without fear. Sophia became a reliable son in that life, a child who had learned grief, but also resilience. She insisted that the angel drawings be framed, not boxed away. One afternoon she brought a caterpillar she'd found and announced solemnly, "It will turn into a butterfly, like everyone." Years moved like pages. The estate's kitchen became noisier with small feet and homework and the smell of real cooking rather than always ordered meals. Lorenzo learned to make a terrible but earnest lasagna, and Mia laughed when he swore the basil lineup was crucial. On some nights they would sit on the balcony where he had once watched city lights and speak about small, human things, a new teacher, an odd neighbor, a moment when Sophia's laughter outran past sorrow. The press eventually stopped seeing him as merely a headline. They wrote soft profiles about his charity work, skeptical at first, but then softer when they saw details. Scholarships in Isabella's name, free music lessons for kids in Little Italy, an after-school program in a neighborhood that used to be a battleground. He gave money and more, time that had been hoarded in the bank of loneliness. One spring morning, Mia woke early and found Lorenzo in the garden by the roses, cradling a tiny, sleeping bundle. Their child, a quiet boy with a curl on his forehead, blinked wakefully and reached blindly toward his mother. Lorenzo's face, seasoned by hard miles, softened into something unrecognizable, a man who had learned how to let go. They named the baby for both past and future, a small ceremony of memory stitched with optimism. The angels Sophia had once drawn found a home on the nursery wall, and the music boxes that had been relics turned into toys. It was not a cure-all. Loss still visited sometimes like an uninvited shadow. But its edges were less sharp, framed now by human hands that chose to keep loving in the face of danger. Years later, when Sophia brought home a school play poster, the butterfly, Lorenzo tacked it on the kitchen corkboard with a proud, clumsy thumb. Mia pressed a kiss to his temple, and he smelled of coffee and the faintest trace of the lemon-scented soap Mia favored. He had been a man forged by violence and iron. He was remade by small, deliberate choices. When he tucked Sophia in that night, and she whispered, "Thank you for finding her," his answer was simple and true. "She found us." Outside, the city shimmered with its old contradictory self, danger and beauty braided together. Inside, a lamp burned low and 3 breaths in a small house marked a fragile, triumphant peace.